Good morning. I am your host, Jennifer Purcell. Living with a Visible Learning Challenge is the name of this podcast. And today we will discuss the challenges and triumphs of those who are neurodivergent living in a neurotypical world that was built for neurotypicals, not neurodivergence. And I hope that this podcast will not only open up your eyes to the challenges that neurodivergents have, but also the ones that maybe neurotypicals have that we can share with you, even if you're not neurodivergent. And also, I have interviews on here with neurodivergent advocates and also with neurotypicals that work with neurodivergence to see how we can interact with each other and how we can embrace our differences and similarities and try to understand each other and come to common grounds and be able to, just kind of help each other live a more harmonious and easier life. Hello. So I am doing a episode on a day I usually don't do one, because I didn't do one for the last couple of Fridays. So I figured I would give you a midweek one. Um, or I guess you could call middle of the week. It's Tuesday, whatever. Um, so uh as you know, Patreon is a supporter of this podcast. You can support it through there. I have transcripts on Patreon, and I have the audio with ads, or with fewer ads, I should say. Um, and then I have Etsy to support the podcast as well. That one is called Woven Differently. And basically on there, I have things that I knit, and they are made by me. And I am going to add some new things soon. I want to add some roses that I um, found for a pattern online to make. And then I also want to add water bottle holders. Haven't quite started on those yet, but I will soon. I just got back from a trip recently, so I'm kind of getting caught up from that. Anyways, today's episode is on developmental learning and visual auditory processing differences and what's the difference between those. So if you see me looking over this way, that's because I'm reading the script, but I'm still here. Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Living with an Invisible Learning Challenge. I'm Jennifer, and today we're going to talk about something that can get really confusing, even for people who have lived with a learning challenge or developmental difference their entire lives. What exactly is the difference between a developmental disability, a specific learning disability, and a visual or auditory processing difference? And where do conditions like autism, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, nonverbal learning disability or NLD, and things like auditory processing differences or Erland syndrome fit? If you've ever heard someone say, well, isn't that all just a learning disability? This episode is for you. Because while these conditions can overlap, they aren't all the same thing. And understanding those differences matter. It matters when you're trying to understand yourself. It matters when you're trying to understand your child. It matters when you're advocating at school or at work for yourself. And it matters because the support that helps one person may not be the support that helps someone else. So let's break this down. First, what does developmental learning, what does developmental disability mean? Let's start with the broadest category. The CDC defines developmental, I'll get it right, developmental disabilities as a group of conditions related to differences or impairments in areas such as physical development, learning, language, or behavior. The then, they begin during the developmental period and can affect everyday functioning and generally last throughout a person's lifetime. One example is autism spectrum disorder. The CDC specifically identifies autism as a developmental disability caused by differences in the brain. Autism can affect communication, social interaction, behavior, learning, attention, and the way someone experiences and responds to the world. And I want to emphasize something here. Autism is not simply a learning disability. Someone can be autistic and have a learning disability. Someone can be autistic and have dyslexia. Someone can be autistic and have ADHD. Someone can be autistic and have an auditory processing disorder or difference. But autism itself is a developmental disability. And autism is also a spectrum, which means there is enormous variation in how it presents from person to person. And a little side note there, I think that's true for all learning differences or developmental differences or disabilities, because I know for me with NVLD and with the other learning differences I don't have them to the same degree, at least the symptoms to the same degree as other people do that I've met that have NLD or have something similar to what I have. Um, so some autistic people have significant communication support needs. Others may be highly verbal. Some may need considerable assistance with daily living, while others may live independently. So we shouldn't assume that because two people share a diagnosis, they have the same experience. And that's one of the themes I've returned to again and again on this podcast. A label can give us information, but it doesn't tell us everything about a person. Now let's talk about learning disabilities or differences, as I like to call them. A specific learning disability is much more focused. The National Institute of Child Health and Human Development explains that learning disabilities affect how someone learns skills such as reading, writing, speaking, or mathematics. They are related to differences in how the brain processes information, and they are not an indication of intelligence. The last part is really important. A learning disability does not mean someone isn't intelligent. In fact, someone can be highly intelligent and still have a significant learning disability. A person might understand incredibly complicated ideas, but struggle to get those ideas onto paper. They might be a brilliant storyteller, but struggle to read a page of text. They might understand advanced mathematics, but have difficulty remembering basic arithmetic facts. Or they might understand that what someone is saying, but struggle to follow a series of spoken directions. The challenge isn't necessarily what the person knows. It may be how the information gets into the brain, gets processed, and comes back out. And that's where things like dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia come in. Dyslexia. Let's start with dyslexia. Dyslexia is primarily associated with difficulties learning to read and spell. It can involve difficulty recognizing words, connecting letters and sounds, reading fluently, and spelling. And dyslexia is not simply seeing letters backwards. That's a common misconception. Some people with dyslexia may have difficulty with phonological processing, essentially processing and manipulating the sounds within spoken language. Reading is incredibly complex. We're taking visual symbols, connecting them with sounds, putting those sounds together, recognizing words, attaching meaning to those words, and then integrating that information into the larger context. So when we say someone has dyslexia, we're not saying they just have trouble reading. We're talking about a particular difference in the way reading related information is processed. And on that note, for me, I think I have a little bit dyslexia because you can't see my script that I'm reading, but it is underlined and it is in pretty big text so I can read it easily. Um, and I know that before was underlining it and before I was making it be bigger, I would jump around and lose my place when I was reading. I'm not doing that anymore. Sometimes I have a hard time pronouncing words. That might be dyslexia as well. Um, Even though I had speech therapy for a little bit when I was a kid, I still have an issue. So I think I have a little bit of that too. Dysgraphia. Then there's dysgraphia, which involves difficulty with writing. And again, it can be more complicated than simply having messy handwriting, which I think I do sometimes. Um, Research describes dysgraphia and disorders of written expression as difficulties with written communication that can involve handwriting, spelling, writing speed, organization, grammar, composition, or getting thoughts onto paper. Think about everything writing requires. You have to generate an idea, organize it, find the words, remember how those words are spelled from letters or type, organize sentences, monitor grammar, and keep track of what you're trying to say. For someone with dysgraphia, some of those processes may require substantially more effort. So a person may be able to explain something beautifully out loud and then produce a written response that looks completely different. That doesn't mean they didn't understand the material. The bottleneck may be written expression. I think I have a little bit of that too, because I know when I was in college, I had a very hard time getting ideas on paper, um, until my mom was helping me with that. And even then, I had challenges, but she made it a little bit easier. So thank you, Mom. Dyscalculia. And then there's dyscalculia, a specific learning disability involving mathematics. It can affect understanding numbers and arithmetic concepts, number relationships, fractions, measurement, calculations, mathematical reasoning, or solving math problems. And here's another place where people can make assumptions. Someone who struggles with math isn't necessarily bad at math. They may understand the logic behind a problem, but have difficulty processing quantities or remembering numerical information. Or they may be able to do something one day and struggle to reproduce it the next. I've had that problem. That's something many people with invisible learning challenges know very well. Performance isn't always consistent, and inconsistency can be one of the most misunderstood parts of having an invisible learning disability or disability. People may think, you did it yesterday. Why can't you do it today? But the brain isn't a machine that produces exactly the same output under every condition. Stress, fatigue, sensory input, distractions, time, pressure, and the complexity of the task can all change how accessible a skill is at a particular moment. So where does NLD fit? Now let's get to one that is particularly important to me on this podcast. Nonverbal learning disability, or NLD, or NVLD, or developmental visual spatial disorder, as they're renaming it. This is where terminology gets complicated. Historically, NLD has been described as involving challenges with things like visual spatial processing, interpreting nonverbal information, social communication, motor coordination, and sometimes executive functioning, where while verbal abilities may be relatively stronger. But here's an important update. NLD is not currently an official DSM-5 diagnosis. That stands for Diagnostic Statistical Manual. In 2025, a research work group proposed the term developmental visual spatial disorder, or DVSD, as a way of better describing what has historically been called NLD. Their proposed criteria emphasizes developmental visual spatial difficulties. However, this is a developing area of research and the terminology it has not become a formal DSM diagnosis. So when I talk about NLD on this podcast, I'm going to continue using the term that many people recognize while acknowledging that the terminology and classification are evolving. And that evolution is important because sometimes people assume that if something isn't officially listed in one diagnostic manual, the person's difficulties aren't real. That's not true. A diagnostic label is a tool. It is not the person's brain, and it certainly isn't the person's worth. So what's the difference about NLD? One way to think about NLD is that the challenge may involve nonverbal and visual spatial information in a broader way than a specific academic skill. For example, someone might have difficulty understanding maps, judging distances, organizing visual information, recognizing patterns, interpreting body language, or understanding the meaning behind someone's facial expressions or tone. And this is where NLD can sometimes overlap with autism. But overlap doesn't mean they're the same thing. Someone can have NLD but not be autistic. Someone can be autistic and not have NLD. And someone could potentially have characteristics associated with both. This is why assessment and individual understanding matter so much. Now let's talk about processing differences. This is where things get really interesting because sometimes the issue isn't primarily the skill we're trying to perform, it's the way information is being processed before we even get to that skill. Let's start with auditory processing. Auditory processing. Have you ever been in a noisy restaurant and thought, I can hear you, but I can't understand you? That's a useful everyday experience. Hearing and understanding aren't exactly the same process. The American Speech Language Hearing Association, or ASHA, describes central auditory processing as the brain's processing of auditory information after sound has traveled through the auditory system. It includes things like distinguishing sounds, recognizing patterns, processing timing, and understanding sounds when there are competing sounds around us. When central auditory processing disorder, or CAPD, the difficulty, sorry, with central auditory processing disorder, CADP, the difficulty involves the neural processing of auditory information. A person might struggle to distinguish sounds, understand speech when there is background noise, process rapidly presented information, or work with competing sounds. And this can have a huge impact on learning. Imagine a teacher giving 5 verbal instructions. For many students, take out your notebook, turn to page 42, answer questions 1 through 5, and then put your paper in the tray. No problem. But imagine that the brain isn't efficiently processing all of that auditory information. The person may hear every word. They may even understand every word individually, but the entire sequence doesn't necessarily make it into usable information. That can look like not paying attention, not listening, being lazy. Why don't you ever follow directions? But what if the person was listening? What if their brain simply processed the information differently? And that's a major theme of invisible learning challenges. Visual processing. Now let's switch from auditory processing to visual processing. When we see something, our eyes receive visual information, but the brain still has to interpret it. Visual processing can involve things like spatial relationships, visual discrimination, memory, and interpreting what we're seeing. This is another reason why vision and visual processing aren't necessarily the same thing. Someone can have healthy eyesight and still experience difficulty processing certain visual information. And that brings us to Irlen syndrome, sometimes called Mears-Irlen syndrome or visual stress. The Irlen organization described Irlen syndrome as a light-based visual processing problem involving difficulty processing light and visual stimuli efficiently. Keep saying the wrong word. People who identify with Irlen type visual stress may report things such as visual discomfort, distortions, headaches, difficulty reading, or sensitivity to certain visual environments. But here's where I want to slow down. The scientific status of Irlen syndrome is more controversial than the status of dyslexia, autism, or specific learning disabilities. There is research supporting aspects of the phenomenon, while other researchers and professionals, organizations, have raised concerns about the evidence and about specific interventions. So I'm not going to tell you that colored overlays or special lenses are a proven treatment for everyone. That's not what the evidence allows us to say. Instead, I think the bigger lesson is this. The way we process visual information can affect learning, attention, comfort, and performance, and we should be willing to investigate those experiences without automatically assuming the person is simply not trying. So how do all of these fit together? Let's put everything we've talked about into a simpler picture. Developmental disabilities are a broad category of conditions that begin during the developmental period and can affect everyday functioning. Autism is an example. Specific learning disabilities involve particular areas of learning, such as reading, writing, or mathematics. Dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia are examples. Processing differences or disorders concern how the brain takes in, organizes, interprets, or responds to information. That can include auditory processing and visual processing. And some conditions can cross categories or overlap. NLD is a great example because it doesn't fit neatly into one box. The current research discussion around NLD and developmental visual spatial disorder shows us that our understanding of these conditions is still evolving. And that's okay. Science is supposed to evolve. Why does any of this matter? You might be thinking. Jennifer, there's a lot of labels. Why does it matter what we call it? Well, because the label can sometimes help us understand what kind of support is actually useful. If someone has dyslexia, we shouldn't just tell them, read more. If someone has dysgraphia, we shouldn't assume that requiring more handwriting will automatically solve the problem. If someone has an auditory processing difficulty, telling them to listen harder isn't necessarily a strategy. And if someone has visual spatial processing challenges, simply giving them more visual information may actually make things harder. We need to ask, what is getting in the way? Is the person having trouble reading, writing, or with numbers? Understanding spoken language, filtering background noise, interpreting visual information, navigating social cues, organizing information, or perhaps several of these at once. That's the question that can lead us towards meaningful support. And this brings me back to the word invisible. One of these reasons I call this podcast Living with an Invisible Learning Challenge is because so many of these differences aren't obvious just by looking at someone. You can't look at me and know my brain processes information differently. You can't necessarily look at someone and know whether reading takes them twice as long. You can't look at someone and know that the reason they didn't follow your verbal directions is because they lost half of the information somewhere between hearing it and processing it. You can't look at someone and know that the bright lights in the room are making it difficult for them to concentrate. And you can't look at someone and know that the person who seems incredibly articulate verbally may struggle tremendously when you ask them to write the same thing down. That's why I think one of the most important questions we can ask isn't what's wrong with you? It's what does your brain need in order to access what you already know? That's a very different question. One more important point. Having one diagnosis doesn't necessarily explain everything. A person can have more than one learning disability or learning differences. Learning differences can also coexist with other developmental or neurodevelopmental conditions. So if you ever thought, but I have dyslexia and that doesn't explain everything I experience, you might be right. Or if you thought I have autism, but I also have a really specific problem with math, that can happen too. Or my hearing is perfectly fine, but I can't understand why what people are saying when there is background noise. That's worth exploring. The goal isn't to collect diagnoses. The goal is to understand the individual. So in closing, if there is one thing I like you to take away from today's episode, it's this. Different doesn't mean deficit or deficient. Developmental disabilities, learning disabilities, and processing differences can affect people in very different ways. But underneath all those terms are real human beings trying to navigate a world that isn't always designed for the way their brains work. And I think that's where we can do better. Instead of assuming someone isn't listening, we can ask whether the information was accessible. Instead of assuming someone is lazy because their work takes longer, we can ask what part of the task is creating the barrier. Instead of assuming someone doesn't understand, we can ask whether they have another way to demonstrate what they know. And instead of asking why can't you just do it? Maybe we can ask, what would make this easier for you? That question can open up an entirely different conversation. And for those of us with invisible learning challenges, sometimes being understood is the first accommodation of all. Thank you for listening to Living with Invisible Learning Challenges. I'm Jennifer Purcell. If today's episode connected with you, I'd love to share it, loved you to share it with someone who might benefit from understanding the difference between learning, developmental, and processing differences. And remember, your brain doesn't have to work exactly like everyone else's brain for your way of thinking to have value. Until next time, take care of yourself, be patient with your brain. Remember that different ways of processing the world can also mean different ways of experiencing, understanding, and contributing to it. Thank you.
Hopefully what you can do with these episodes on this podcast, Living with Invisible Learning Challenge, I would like to challenge you to journal about the episodes and just see what you learn from them. Or you can share about the episodes with your friends and family and see what they can learn from them. And as always, I will post the links to the articles that I use in the description of the podcast. And please let me know if you know somebody who you think would want to be interviewed on this podcast, or if you yourself would want to be interviewed. Please email me. I have my email on my website, and I also have it pretty much pretty accessible on Facebook and Instagram through messaging as well. So you can get in contact with me in those ways.